everybody, and welcome. Sorry for a little bit of a delay, but we're going to get started. I'm Johanna Burton. I'm the Director and Curator of Education and Public Engagement here at the new museum. And I just wanted to welcome everybody to what I think is going to be an incredibly special talk on the occasion of Simone Lee's project here, The Waiting Room. And first and foremost, I want to say, like everything we do in the department, this is really a collective effort. Hi, Tina. But Simone in particular, I think, embodies this spirit in a way that we so fully appreciate and embrace. And so, first of all, I want to thank my co-curators, Emily Mello and Sean Leonardo, who were absolutely amazing in this project. And then all of Simone's collaborators, both that have already participated and will, and most of all, Simone, you've been a real inspiration. We love having you here. So tonight we're welcoming Chitra Ganesh, who's going to give a talk on disobedience, something I think we all need to hear a lot about these days. And just before I hand this off to Emily, who's going to give a little information on the talk tonight, I wanted to just place this event within both Simone's residency, but within the work we do in the education department, which has, for a long time, and even before my time here, really resided in the work of artists and artists who work with us really on site. So this is a residency that is the first, actually, of our summer residencies devoted to social justice, something that will continue every summer. And we work really closely with collaborators, both in the neighborhood and beyond. And so, again, Simone, you've helped us really kick this off in a way that's meaningful and incredible. So thank you. And with that, Emily is going to give us a little introduction and some information. This is Sean, our other co-curator, who is our manager of community outreach and teen programs, and also a new addition in the last year. So, all right, thank you so much for coming, and welcome.
Thank you for coming. I also want to thank Lady Sasha Jones, our seasoned fellow, for helping to organize this program, and others this season. And before I do introduce the talk, I had one other little surprise to announce, which is on your way out, hot off the presses, there will be a limited edition print that you can put in your broadsheet that you can also pick up on a table outside, designed by a frequent collaborator of Simone's, Nuncy Matiti, who designed also the Waiting Room magazine from the first iteration of the project, the Free People's Medical Clinic, as well as our broadsheet here for the Waiting Room. So that is a treat. And for this lecture, organized in conjunction with the Waiting Room, artist Chitra Ganesh will draw from her recent visual research on the aesthetics and performative gestures of protest, exploring the notion of disobedience as it has been mobilized in political protest and social movements outside of the United States. Ganesh will share images and texts that elaborate on forms of disobedience as harnessed most specifically in the global South, and that challenge structural power and actualize social change, drawing attention to state-sponsored violence and erasures enacted on human bodies. For over a decade, Ganesh's drawing-based practice has probed mythological and queer narratives to develop complex visual iconographies of female subjectivity and power. Her work has been widely exhibited locally and internationally, and she is the recipient of numerous awards, including the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship in the Creative Arts. And a little more about Chitra. She is a Brooklyn-based artist whose drawing, installation, text-based work and collaborations suggest and excavate buried narratives typically absent from official canons of history, literature, and art. Ganesh graduated from Brown University with a BA in comparative literature and art semiotics and received her MFA from Columbia University. She has held residencies, just a few of them that I will name of many, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, New York University, Headland Center for the Arts, Skowhegan School of Painting. Her works have been widely exhibited across the United States, including at the Queens Museum, the Asia Society, the Berkeley Art Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, and solo presentations at PS1 MoMA, the Andy Warhol Museum, the MoCA in Shanghai, the Fondazione Sandretto in Italy, the Gwangju Contemporary Art Center in Korea, And her works are represented in prominent international collections, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and several others. I also wanted to mention that her last solo exhibition was a site-specific commission at the Brooklyn Museum. Please join me in welcoming Chitra Ganesh.
Hello, friends and family and audience members. It's so lovely to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Simone, for inviting me, and thank you, Emily and Sean and the whole team at the New Museum for putting this amazing event together. So, in tonight's lecture on disobedience, I'm going to talk about my own engagement, both experiential and visual, with protest as a form of disobedience, and to consider particular gestures and acts, which I found through the process of engaging these acts and these imagery to reveal an extremely performative and dynamic nature to the act of disobedience. So, in preparing for this lecture, I was thinking about my own engagement with protest and disobedience as a young adult, and much of it. Oh, here we go. And much of it was inspired by a project that I had started with Mariam Ghani in 2004, Index of the Disappeared, which in turn was inspired by a series of disturbing political events that continue to shape our world. So our work was at that point interested in a set of disappearances and deportations and physical erasures and absences of people in the post-9/11 era. And through this process, our collaboration began and my kind of adult relationship with protest began. That said, I went to some protests when I was in high school, abortion protests, and I found them to be, I found the Women of Now, the National Organization for Women, to be largely women I couldn't identify with. So I wanted to just put that out there because I'll come back to that point later. So I'm just going to flip through some of the experiences that kind of inspired my own research and coming back to this issue. So some of you in this room have actually been with me on many of these different protests. So you'll see perhaps yourselves or others. This is an image from around 2003 and 4, the mobilization, one of the first kind of mass mobilizations that I witnessed as an adult against the US invasion in Iraq. These actions were taken in conjunction with Mariam and my project of building an archive of people who had been disappeared and the kinds of places into which they had been disappeared, largely from Arab and South Asian communities after September 11th. So a lot of the in this way, protests that demanded governments and institutions recognize the bodies that inhabit our soil and the ways in which they contribute to the U.S. was very much part of what I was interested in. And this engagement emerged organically from being part of a number of different progressive communities, immigrant rights communities, queer communities, progressive South Asian spaces, a frequent feature of which was trying to understand and analyze structural power and giving voice to the fact that some bodies always seem to have much more value than others, and how those bodies that are devalued can be called forth in public space to draw attention to these structural imbalances. So this was an ongoing engagement that felt more episodic. And then at a certain point, it began to feel very constant. So there was march after march and protest after protest around the killing of Black men, women, and children unarmed, largely by police. And there was also, at the same time, for me, there was a kind of growing recognition of the right wing government that has come into power in India. This is in New York here. So these kind of formed the context for some of my inquiry, and thinking about how these mass mobilizations and acts of civil disobedience were pointing out how certain groups of people, specifically those who gained by upholding and benefiting from racial, religious, and economic power hierarchies, were being called into question and challenged. So that kind of led me to think about how civil disobedience and how mass movements occupying public space operate in my life and in our lives today versus perhaps some of the historical ideas that I had about civil disobedience. So when I was reflecting on the idea of civil disobedience, on nonviolent actions such as these, the visual images and historical moments that were conjured for me had this kind of look and feel. So this is from the Salt March in India in 1930, which was drawing attention to the fact that the British were taxing salt, and was one of the more successful aspects of the Quit India movement, which later gave India independence. So this kind of sense of a multitude of often disparate groups whose voices are underrepresented or absent from mainstream political and legal discourse. This is a series of revolutionary protests in 1968 in France, during which workers and students came together to try and critique the government in power at the time, but the violence that some of these protests spurred actually in some ways allowed the party to remain in power and not be as challenged by some of the socialist critique at the time. So these kinds of ideas of coming together in large public spaces and of thinking, reimagining the possibility of public space, reimagining the way in which it functions, coming together in a large national public space that is meant to represent democracy but was built by slaves. And thinking about how civil disobedience carries with it a legacy of anti-colonialism, anti-racism, and class solidarity that demands that all bodies are counted equally, and some of the contemporary legacies of those. So this is an image of an immigrant rights march in LA in 2006. And this is an image marking the anniversary of the Arab Spring in January of 2016, marking the anniversary in 2011. So there was something I noticed about the contemporary images and the kind of turn that civil disobedience took at a certain point, which really struck me in having a kind of a different visual language, or perhaps it was just one that I started to be more attuned to, and how this kind of arrangement of bodies in space in some ways is similar to the mass mobilizations that you see earlier, but it's also conscious in some way of the fact that the technology for documentation that we have now allows us to zoom back out from spaces and see these images in very different ways, and actually kind of think about one of the things I was thinking about was actually the visual composition of these images and how inspiring they were, and they recalled often for me the kind of grand gesture that I recall from seeing history paintings, and um, this this kind of visual image that really points to the the necessity for bodies in chaos in order to kind of impel some kind of change. Something that's very different for me from our culture of one, our culture of the individual, of individual fame, of selfies, of all of the ways in which one represents people, but actually it's a representation of the self. So this is a die-in at Grand Central, and these die-ins were in response to the Department of Justice refusing to indict the officers responsible for Eric Garner's death in December of 2014. So I was just thinking about the kinds of images that looking at these images of die-ins recalled for me, the variety of historical painting, the way in which the figures are positioned within the space, and thinking about the visual and spatial impact that our contemporary modes of protest and these performative gestures, such as die-ins, really make us think about, or made me think about. So, in looking further into these ideas of the die-in, the body in chaos, and also the very visual formations of people gathering that involved other kinds of signifiers and objects besides just the people themselves or the signs that they were holding. I began to look into sort of other die-ins and places in which those kinds of events might have happened. This is an image from 2011, and it's a group of villagers who are lying on the road to demand that the nuclear power plant, which was going to be built in their village, be stopped so that they could continue their livelihood and their existence. So I was thinking a lot about this because I was also thinking about bodies occupying public space, and for people who don't have a lot of means or resources, who don't have land, who don't have property, who have precarious housing conditions, who work informally, who don't have stable jobs. Simply occupying public space when they are not laboring is actually the transgression. So the idea of what kinds of bodies transgress in which ways by being in public space is very much determined by poverty, by class, and also by gender. So thinking about those things, it really made me feel even more the power of some of these images. So this is an image from 2011. It's Yemeni anti-government citizens who are demonstrating to demand a trial of the president who was in power at that time. Among some of the first images that I encountered, which I was interested in, that kind of brought me to this place, I wanted to share some of those with you. So, when Mariam and I were doing our work for Index of the Disappeared, we were looking into past moments of disappearance and ways in which people brought attention to them. So, this is a group that was very much interesting to me, both because of the actions and also the iconography that their actions generated. So this is a group called the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and it's a group of Argentinian mothers whose children were disappeared during the state-sponsored terrorism of the military dictatorship that was happening during the years of 1976 and 1983. So they organized in the process of trying to learn about what was happening to their sons, and in order to seek some kind of justice or investigation for those missing bodies and some kind of recuperation for those erasures. So one of the things I was interested in around this particular group was the way in which their movement generated a certain kind of iconography, which they actually created and became a way to continue the discourse and the challenge around the issues that they were interested in. So the headscarf in this case became a kind of signifier of women or subjects who would not typically be in public space voicing their demands to be there and stay there. So it was these little moments of where one fragmented signifier actually could evolve to hold a much larger and more complex sense of projects and ideas, as well as moments that revealed I guess, the performative endurance that a lot of these protests required and called for. So in this way, I wanted to, we're in a moment of performance and of social practice. Those things are very exciting, and they have a place within art institutions and within art spaces. And I wanted to also think together and think through how protest and performance art could occupy overlapping spaces, and how, in this case, what I'm showing you here is these are the blistered feet of a group of villagers who had decided to do what's called a Jal Satyagraha, which is Jal means water, and Satyagraha is a nonviolent action. So in order to protest the construction of a dam and the way in which the dam would raise the waters of the area surrounding them and thereby actually threaten their housing and livelihood, they stood in the water continuously for 13 days in a row. So, so 51 people there were two different areas in which this happened, two different areas that were affected by the rising water of this dam project. And in both of those areas, the protesters stood there and remained there to demand compensation and adequate rehabilitation for people whose homes were going to be submerged as a result of this development project. So these are some of the images from that. So the idea of performative endurance as being something that is actually necessary in order to stay alive was inspiring for me, and was also in contrast to some of the ways in which we experience performance as it might be reenacted via a Marina and a Jay-Z staring at each other in the MoMA. So I was thinking about I was thinking about some of those things, and I was thinking about how so many of the subjects who were at the forefront of this kind of disobedience were women who do not have a lot of economic or social power. I mean, they are women who perhaps are face caste discrimination, face a number of different kinds of discrimination, and they are willing to use their bodies in ways that we would not expect, and not necessarily in ways that are about about kind of drawing attention to or desire to that body. So, this is a group of activists. This is in Guwahati, which is in Assam, which is in the eastern part of India, and these women went to the police station in order to protest the government evicting people from land, but also to protest the death in custody of a young woman who had been raped and then died in police custody. So this idea of how women occupy public space, and also made me think about one of the impetuses for Simone's project that we had talked about, which was the death of Edith Rodriguez. I don't know if is that in the literature of the waiting room. Edith Green. Okay. Yeah. Esme Green. Okay. So that was another woman who died in a very similar way. But the death in question happened because a woman was waiting for hours and hours without being noticed in an emergency room until she finally collapsed and died. And it made me think about how certain bodies are allowed to occupy public space and allowed to occupy lots of space, and how others are absolutely expected to get out of the way. And this kind of this kind of gendered access to public space is something that I realized happens even on the most minute level in such a variety of places. So as a person growing up in New York City who rode the subway since I was born and rode it alone since I was 9, one of the things I remember most from riding the subway as a young child was being told how to sit, and being told to cross my legs and not spread my legs and not take up too much space. And I was also thinking about that in the context of how the occupation of public space has an extremely gendered context and history, and how that history is not just something that's happening out there somewhere where women are oppressed but they're not here. I mean, but these kinds of dynamics inflect even our own daily commutes and lives. So this kind of reflection made me really excited to think through these images, both for their visual power and their compositional elegance, as well as for the ways in which they bring forth all of these issues. So as I was looking through these various images of protest and thinking about disobedience and thinking about challenging power, I was also realizing that there were a series of objects and gestures that repeated themselves over and over again, though in different contexts and in different ways. So this image and the following one is in response to the kidnapping of 276 schoolgirls in Nigeria, which some people may have heard of, but many people also may have not because it was actually not really in the news. And so this is again reflects the worth and quality given to certain bodies over others. And so tools such as the megaphone, signifiers of a certain kind of disobedience, as well as actions that I noticed, which repeated themselves in around different issues and actually around the world. So this is an image from protests against the gang rape that happened in Delhi in 2012. And these are images from the critique on US involvement in foreign soil and creating wars for decades and decades. This was around 2003 or 4. So, along with this kind of instantiation of performing silence, there's also certain other gestures like the raised fist and certain other kinds of instruments, such as the bamboo, that I noticed were repeating themselves as well, these signifiers of disobedience. So, this image is a group called the Gulabi Gang, who were first appeared in Uttar Pradesh, which is a state in North India, and has since spread, but had appeared as a response to domestic abuse and violence against women, as well as land grabs and economic exploitation. So the idea of all of these issues being intertwined was also something that I thought was interesting, because there were so many ways in which, so many times I had heard from my peers, well, I'm not a feminist because feminism is a white thing, or it's an old white lady thing, or it's just something we can't relate to. And I would always think, well, you just actually need to look outside of the US to know that this is absolutely not true. So just thinking about the way in which many of the issues and justice that was sought was not just around one set of issues, but was actually a number of different kinds of structural inequalities that were combined. So I'm just gonna flip through these images kind of quickly now. These are, you can see I'm just trying to show the kind of language, the visual language that accumulated through really closely reading the bodily gestures that accompanied a lot of these protests. And the number of different contexts in which hands up actually functions, and the way in which hands signify in the challenge to power. So, and I'm going through these quickly, but if you have questions about individual images, we could talk about which ones or what they are later. So, I was thinking a lot about this particular image of the raised fist and how it was repeating itself, not just in the context of Black Power, which is how I learned of it growing up, but in a variety of instantiations of performing disobedience. So, and how images like these become kind of iconic to a certain moment of protest. So these themes around the occupation of public space, and sometimes very extreme versions of that. These are This is an image of a nun who had set herself on fire in November of 2011 as a way to draw attention to the Chinese occupation of Tibet and to the number of Tibetan exilees, and how the act of one person can actually kind of generate not just an attention to themselves and a kind of messianic interest in what they're doing, but actually bring it outward into a much larger issue, and how these acts can be extremely dramatic and spectacular and disturbing as this one, or they can be what we would consider very mundane acts in private, which then take on a much more extraordinary dimension in public, such as lying down or standing. So this is an image from this guy had become known as the Standing Man, and this was the beginning of a series of silent protests that happened in Taksim Square in Istanbul in Turkey, because there were protests against the government closing down a public park and redeveloping it. And in response to those protests, police brought in tear gas and violence. And so the response to the state-sponsored violence was this man who just began standing. And standing in public became this extreme kind of fuck you act in this context. And this actually developed into a kind of a standing protest, which then included reading. So that the woman is reading a paper about the man. I think you can see the image of the standing man underneath. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he's actually a performance artist and a teacher himself. So these are some of the other iterations of the standing protest. And finally, to close, just to bring back the way in which protest and performance really are intertwined in our moment, and endurance, I just wanted to end with images like these, where it's a much more legibly performative aspect to disobedience. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And I'd love to talk or answer questions, or here I have comments. And I wanted to say also that as I was putting these images together, there's a lot I edited out, even if you can imagine. So I know that it's not a kind of I was aware that there were several gaps in here that makes it far from encyclopedic, but it was more interested in drawing out images and gestures that related to how I was thinking about these bodies in space.
In the beginning, you mentioned how you went to the Now protest and how you didn't. Did you say you couldn't identify with that? I was wondering if you can expand on that.
Sure. So I was 15, and I took a bus by myself to Washington, D.C. that left at 5 in the morning and came back at 11 at night with the blessings of my mother, who was really happy that I was doing this. And I didn't know what to expect, but I did not expect such a what I felt was a homogenous audience. I mean, I was also very young, so perhaps anyone who was an adult just looked old to me. It's hard to say going back, but I know that there was a way in which the women's issues or women's equality was talked about at home that did not actually get reflected in what I experienced or saw in my own first experiences of protests. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I was 17 actually, or 18. Yeah. So, but oh, you were there too. Yeah. So then, you were the exception, or you weren't the exception. But I just saw it, and probably saw it in a very reduced way as a teenager.
Thank you, Chitra. Sorry. I wondered if you could say a little bit about the abject body as a motif, maybe, because the images that you showed, I couldn't help but also think about the opposite of those images, meaning like maybe the circulation of the image of Eric Garner dying, right, and how then that image is also used as proof in a way. So I wondered about the intersection of the kind of images that are self-scripted or choreographed versus proof of abjection in a way.
So that's such a great question and something I often think about. So I think something that I feel very haunting about our current moment is that we are presented with a preponderance of evidence, of visual evidence of someone being shot, of visual evidence of people being hacked to death on a street, but that evidence doesn't necessarily translate into any kind of legal resolution or any kind of recuperation of power or subjectivity. So I think that's one of the things that I was thinking about. Like there is a way in which abject images have been used to, especially of, say, when I was growing up, I saw this of South Asian women, like been used to mobilize a certain kind of pity or a certain kind of paternalistic desire to help, rather than thinking about the fact that even if those bodies were healthy and alive, they would always already be considered abject because of how marginalized they are.
Which ones were paintings or drawings that you've done and photographs you've taken, and which ones were part of your research? And it seems like there might have been a combination. And then my second question is regards to winning. In terms of we saw a whole set of demonstrations and protests demanding different things, and I don't expect you to go back through each of those instances, but if you could speak of, what does it mean when these demonstrations translate to people getting what they seek, and the times in which they don't. And I guess I'm specifically thinking about the images of New York and the anti-war protests, the enormous protest on February 15th against the war in Iraq, and how difficult, right, it's been to recuperate in the aftermath of that, because so many thousands of people came to the street in New York, in San Francisco, across the world, and yet the war happened anyway. So if that informs some of your thinking about people taking up public space and what it means.
Yeah, so the first, all of the first images of the protests were my own photography of various, culminating at the Black Lives Matter image, were all various things that we had attended. And then the remainder of the images are, for the most part, my own research. Some of these images are part of our Index of the Disappeared archive as well. And there's really only 4 or 5 images that are images that I made. And those are mostly clearly differentiated because they're paintings. So, and then in regards to your second question, I mean, I think that's great. One of the things I was thinking about as I put these images together is how many of these movements have had problematic twists and turns in terms of the transfer of power, in regards to corruption, in regards to internal dissent within the movement. And I think that one of the things that I'm was thinking about around the idea of disobedience is just like gender or any other kind of subjective mode, it needs to be constantly performed in order for that thing to be reiterated and true. So I think it's really about the accumulation of gestures and intentions that actually create a larger framework of struggle or of protest or of people occupying public space, which, at least for me and the time period in which I grew up, there was a really big gap around that. There was a discussion of the anti-Vietnam War protests, and then there was a lot of silence, and then there was ACT UP, die-ins, and people being chaining themselves to the CDC. And then there were a few more other events, but I definitely felt like, a million people will turn up in Rome to protest some kind of workers' legislation, and the culture of protest is just not alive and well here in the United States as it is in many other places.
The effectiveness of like this kind of like civil disobedience? Like, do you think that the way that these like iconic images are being reproduced and shared at like such a rapid rate is influencing the effectiveness of like civil disobedience overall, or is like not helping them?
I mean, I think that there was a lot of discussion of die-ins, specifically the die-ins that were happening at the end of 2014, as being viral in nature. So I think that's there. But another thing that struck me that I felt was extraordinary, which I didn't show here, but was also researching at the time, was the relationship between the hunger strikes at Guantanamo and in Pelican Bay. So these are people who are in a windowless cell for 23 hours a day. They haven't seen anything. What they've heard and what they've gleaned is what they go on. And the way in which those movements kind of echoed and reverberated off of one another, I think is quite extraordinary.
Thank you. Hi. Could you say a little bit more about the strengths or the weaknesses of performance and protest sharing the same space?
I don't know about strengths and weaknesses. I mean, um, I think it's interesting how certain gestures feel spectacular in many different contexts. I mean, for example, the gesture of lighting oneself on fire, but then how other gestures that are not necessarily thought of as performative, like standing, take on a performative dimension. Hi. I think the focus on individualism and the decimation of the left have probably contributed the most to the direction in which protest culture in the United States has gone.
Hi, I have a question. I was wondering, it was very interesting you pointed out when you compare these die-ins or these active protests and the imagery of that to something like those images you saw of people occupying public space as a transgression just because of poverty or because of lack of any availability, which is starkly different from the chaos you would see in protest. But in that setting, which is kind of a continual daily existential thing for them, did you see any similarities in the imagery, or would you make that extrapolation that there are similarities in the imagery of those people and their transgression or protest, which is rather more chronic or existential for them because it is not a particular cause that they're sleeping out for?
So are you you're mentioning some protests that don't necessarily have a cause, but are
No,
maybe more existential?
what I'm alluding to is one of the pictures, and correct me if I'm wrong, which you were talking about as being occupying public space, which is out of a necessity rather out of poverty. There are so many occupations of public space in urban environments that are not out of an act of protest, but which are still bodies in a public space, which can be compared to the die-ins, which are an act of active protest and have the chaotic element associated with it. I'm not sure if
Oh,
one of the images which you showed were the former was of the former. If you saw any similarities in the imagery of those instances compared to these acts of protest in terms of the bodies themselves in the public space.
I think that it's which body is like I think one of the differences is which bodies inhabit public space and in what concentration. And I think that yes, to me, the gathering of bodies in public space for leisure or celebration looks and feels different from taking that space for a kind of discourse with or challenge to power, which is especially in certain places that leisure is also tied to consumerism and tied to other kinds of activities or acts that aren't necessarily connected to the occupying space in order to make your body counted or highlight the disappearance or the death of a loved one. Yeah, and then hi.
I'm wondering if there's any reason you didn't include imagery of protests that are more violent, that also have gestures like throwing rocks at tanks and throwing Molotov cocktails and stuff like that?
I didn't actually think about there being necessarily a clear-cut separation actually between. I mean, I was thinking about civil disobedience as being kind of the core of what I was looking at, and also looking at gestures that were as much about the quiet and the silence as they were about the noise and the energy. And I also think that a lot of there's a really gray line in all of these movements. I mean, sometimes it becomes violent and sometimes it doesn't. So I didn't necessarily think of these are violent protests and these are nonviolent ones. And many movements have all of those different kind of positions.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak a little to maybe some of the more intrinsic motivations for performance as a protest tactic, and the way that performance has always been taught to me is like a resilience tactic, and a kind of a restorative protest tactic that can be more sustainable perhaps for longer. And I was wondering if you came across any. I know a lot of this sense art is like extrinsically focused, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that as well.
About the intrinsic value of performance.
Yeah.
In relation to protest?
Yes.
Well, I think that there's a lot of, in performance that is perhaps not in direct relation to political protest. I think there are some ideas or aims that are shared. For example, reimagining the space between bodies in public space, the idea of a body enduring a certain act or a certain position, the idea of reorienting or reformulating the direction or the dialectic of a gaze. And so I think that this kind of, I mean, I didn't include these images, but there's also lots of masks and other kinds of more theatrical performativity that accompanies disobedience. And so I think that it's just a way of calling attention to the fact that how bodies occupy space and how bodies are read is not natural, and it's naturalized, perhaps, but these are actually the effect of a variety of um, structural hierarchies and access.
Hello, thank you for this presentation. So I've noticed in a lot of the discourse around social practice art that it's usually framed as a move away from modes of like representational mode, and more towards like community organizing, creation of new structures and things like that. And so I thought this was a really wonderful reminder of the ways in which a lot of protest happens in the realm of the visible. And clearly with your work, you're still dedicated to representation. And a lot of the politics you're talking about is about making things visible. So I was wondering if you think about that in what you're doing, how that relates to the kind of direct action occupation protest, if you think about that in terms of visibility or representation with regard to maybe other types of social practice art?
I mean, in my own work, I think I've always been struck and troubled by what gets represented visually and what doesn't, and that came from an experience of going to museums where the only Indian thing was 5,000 years old. So that gap of millennia, those gaps are kind of the spaces that I feel like are fertile for thinking through other modes of representing. I'm not sure I can. I'm not sure how much I can speak to the relationship between that and social practice. I don't necessarily think of social practice as something that is central to my work. I mean, being involved in communities and in politicized communities has always been a part of how I live and party and think and work. But it isn't something that I feel is actually part of my art practice. Are we done? Oh.
Thanks, Chitra. Well, from your presentation, one thought I had, or a feeling that I'm having, is that the riskier, possibly more performative acts of resistance are enacted by those bodies from which safety and dignity has been robbed. Do you feel that those people or those bodies that believe they have more to lose are more easily contained when it comes to public protest?
I think so. I mean, I don't know that. I think, yeah, there's definitely bodies that have a lot less access and that endure a lot more arduous conditions of labor and living. But I don't think any of them are actually actually completely stripped of their dignity. So that's one thing. But I think that there are some people who benefit from the way that things are, and those people would be less likely to act against them. Yeah.
So I have a question about the idea of community and how that's played a major role in protest over the images you've shown cover, 50s, 60s, all the way up until now. And the idea of civil disobedience and protests in the 60s of actually standing up and being counted as a physical presence. I'm curious as to hear your thoughts on how that's shifted now that communities are becoming more digital and people are kind of taking a little bit more of the easy way out to say, yes, I care about this issue, I'm protesting, whatever, what have you, but doing it by signing an online petition or sharing a thought on Facebook. And how do you think that that has a major contribution to our collective inability for, this mass public outrage?
I think it depends. I mean, I think there is a lot of sharing in social media that requires less courage than sharing in person. And I think there's also a lot of it that really emboldens a culture of me and a culture of I'm going to tell everybody the truth now. As to whether or not that is more or less effective,
More specifically, do you think that that is taking away from our sense of physical community and people gathering together?
I mean,
in real life?
Generally, yes. But also, I think it's interesting because I feel like, for example, something that I notice with Black Lives Matter, for example, is that it actually doesn't have a physical location. And that's really smart considering what happened to Occupy Wall Street, where from A to Z, it was just decimated. I mean, there was a binder of every city in America where Occupy Wall Street was happening, and that was infiltrated. So, I mean, I think that the idea of not having a physical location can be mobilized in different ways.
Not thinking about other work of yours that is not painting. And I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about, for you, the distinction between transgression and disobedience, and then performance and a kind of non-performance that I think you hint at in some of the images that are a thing that happens prior to the mass mobilization in the frame that's more political or in the frame that's already very public. And I feel like we've spoken about these things in a sense, but I'm wondering if you could draw out how you're thinking about this as a certain kind of politics that's mapping with disobedience versus other kinds of transgressions that might not have that kind of political, urban, like public space frame.
I think that one of the things that I was interested in is where, depending on the body or the subjectivity you inhabit, whether your act is considered transgressive or is considered kind of something that would melt into like a larger, more accepted mobilization. So I think that that's there. I think that there are, of course, a million transgressions that are discursive or that happen in private space or intimate space that could also be counted. But I was interested in how a lot of those conflicts, for example, that are usually limited to a domestic sphere or to the sphere of the workplace, which largely remain hidden, are then like vomited out into a more visible and more accessible space. And then what was the second question again?
I don't even know. I think it was.
Okay.
I mean, if there was anything interesting that you wanted to go off of, if there wasn't. I was just the same. um, I think I said performance, non-performance, but it was, the figure you have like of the standing man in Turkey. And I think you allude to it in other ways too, because in a sense, some of the protests that are singular that become catalysts for a different kind of gathering. I guess I'm thinking of it as kind of a different kind of understanding of performance that's, for lack of a better term, non-performance.
No, I mean, I was thinking also about that, about how certain acts. Oh, wait a minute. How did that happen? Let me go back to the presenter view. How certain acts that are not necessarily considered performance actually take on a performative dimension based on the ways in which the spaces in which they're happening are regulated. So, I mean, someone standing in front of a theater about to give a monologue would then become kind of part of an expected performance, but then perhaps somebody standing in the same way that they would stand to wait for a traffic light to turn green, but just standing, then has a different kind of signification, and just how those significations kind of blur based on the space, the place, the body, the context.
I wanted to follow up on that question because I thought it was really interesting choice. The word efficacy has come up a few times. What is expected to happen, and how do we gauge the success of an event? And it's a conversation we've had with Simone actually quite a bit. Symbolic gesture versus something having a kind of metrics attached to it. And I think your question brings up for me, it was really nice when you were presenting all the images not to necessarily talk about the outcome, but instead to talk about what you called later an accretion of images. And I just wondered if you could talk about how the symbolic operates within activism, and how those two things, I think right now, kind of crucially are at odds with each other in the public imagination, because there is a desire for immediate change politically, but then how art and performance perhaps operates with a different framework, and maybe we have to sort of change those expectations. I guess I just wondered if you could talk about that rub, because it's something that comes up a lot when artists are engaged in political change, but not necessarily willing to give up their practice as an artist.
So I think, so as part of my work that I do with Mariam on Index of the Disappeared, where we've been in conversation for like a decade and a half with a couple of lawyers. And so one of the things that we talk about together is just the different sense of speed or velocity or lack thereof through which one mode of doing would achieve some kind of justice or visibility versus another. So I think that, for example, in the law, the categories are really binding and they're really rigid. So the way in which you would navigate that kind of discourse is so different from the terrain that we have in art. And I think part of that terrain involves a certain kind of a flexibility and freedom and a way to bring attention to a certain issue without necessarily being instrumental. But I think we live in a very instrumental environment, where if I do this, then this is going to happen. If I have this many followers, then I'm going to become famous. If I eat this thing, I'm going to lose 40 pounds. I mean, we're in this moment where we expect a lot of immediate results, and that's sort of individually driven. So I think that using any space, art or discursive or legal, to think about like the slow burn, keeping the pilot light on, is important, and is something that I learned from my friends, for example, who do appeals work, where the majority of cases they will actually lose, and they actually know that those people will die, like at their hands. But that doesn't then mean that what they're doing is not worthwhile. So. Yes, I think so. And in my experience, yes. And I think that some of those behaviors that would be considered partying, but also would be considered transgressive, like public sex or looking for public sex, is a place in which those two intersect.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. Oh, that's so loud. This really is the age of the influencer, I feel. We're always talking about influencers and influential people in different, like this is political. Do you feel that you've come across many political influencers who make a difference, that we have them and that they are going to make a change?
Well, one of the most important political influences in my life is Swati P. Shah, and that's my partner, and I think that the influences can actually be very close to home, and they don't have to be that public. I mean, she taught me everything about understanding a structural analysis of power and thinking about how and why class is or isn't absent in the US in our discourses here. And so, among many other things. But I mean, I think that the influences are near and far, both.
If the actual protesters are conscious of the performance that we see of them, and if that.
I think it depends on who the we is and where we are and who the action is aimed at. But yeah, I think a lot of these actions are aiming for a larger audience than the audience that is physically present in that place. And a lot of things in many places that have started very locally have then drawn attention to much larger issues, like the villagers who submerged themselves in sand and were protesting the construction of the nuclear power plant, actually draws attention to the way in which nuclear energy might be considered fashionable amongst developing countries to cultivate, while in fact it only constitutes 3% of the total energy, and while in fact half of the population lives without energy. And I think people are thinking about those things. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving this talk. I think it was really informative and really useful, like in terms of drawing comparisons like among
different movements across countries and across time. Um, my question is kind of complicated, so it's a kind of like, there are three things that have been said that kind of lead to the question that I had. One comment was basically saying that do you feel that there are some people who almost have like more to lose or more is at stake in order, and perhaps that is why they're like, if there's more at stake, are they more likely to engage in riskier forms of demonstrations or nonviolent movements? And then there was another question that asked, is it like, what are your thoughts on like the form of activism that uses a vehicle of social media, like posting a comment on Facebook or making a link to like an article that refers to a certain protest or a certain cause, and whether there's how courageous is that? And then you also mentioned that there are certain people who may benefit from existing social structures. So in light of those three things, my question is, how can one try to engage in actually creating change in a way that's authentic to who that person is, at like from a place of authenticity, not necessarily just trying to be brave, because that's where a lot of change comes from, and not necessarily trying to like be protected by like social media and the anonymity that can provide, but like actually create change in like a real way in daily life that is true to who that person is, and if that makes any sense.
Well, I mean, in terms of social media, like one thing that I'm thinking about is and me too, we're talking about social media as though we have a shared relationship to it. So I think the first thing is that we don't, but the differences are much more nuanced than they could be. But I think in certain situations, blogging is a life-threatening activity, and has been so. So I think that there's different ways in which one's activity on social media is apprehended based on one's location. So I think that's one thing. I think that, I think often working locally is something that can provide a series of interactions that feels meaningful on a daily basis. You see that a lot in people who are doing tenant rights organizing. They're working with people that they live next door to, and there's a bond and a need there for what's happening there. So I think that's one way. I don't know about the efficacy of sharing an article on social media. In my experience, it seems that the way that Big Brother constructs the algorithms is that we tend to be around like-minded opinions. So that's one thing to consider. So I don't know, actually.
Thank you.
And I do think there are people who troll social media and who monitor political activity on social media as activists, just as they would have infiltrated the physical space of critical resistance. I think that's also happening on social media.
One more question.
Hi, I was wondering what you think about the latest performance of Pavlensky in terms of his body. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, then he's a Russian performer who burned the door to KGB, and he was arrested for that, and he was he became a very heroic figure in Russia, but in my opinion, he just carries a bunch of other messages, and for me, it's not very clear exactly what he was trying to do and what he accomplished and how that worked. That's why I was trying to ask you.
Yeah, I don't know enough about his work, so I can't say, but I do think that we're in a moment where people definitely benefit from the work of others to gain individual notoriety and success. Yeah.
Oh, geez, last question. A lot of pressure. So I guess my question is about the intersection of aesthetic representation and political representation, and what kind of politics, because I guess I see possibility in a different way of doing politics, a different way of relating to each other through art that is not necessarily legalistic or state-based, or not that kind of politics. And I was wondering, yeah, like what you thought about that, because all of these questions came up about efficacy, and I'm wondering like what kind of change we're even talking about. Like clearly there is a transformative impact, transformative process of creation happening. Yeah. So I guess I was wondering like what kind of politics, how you saw this process of like collective creation and art making and as political.
I think that, so, I mean, I showed a very broad range of imagery to think about how certain gestures or acts accumulate to form like a lexicon, a visual lexicon of protest. So that said, I think that all of the things that I've showed have extremely deep specificity. And so I think it may feel like there's a kind of collapsing of certain ideas around creativity and art. But I'm saying all of this to say that I think that those questions are really contextually bound, and it really depends on the place, the people, the moment, the aim, the duration, and the political context. So, I mean, in this moment here in New York is going to be very different from in this moment in San Cristobal in Mexico down the road. So I think that